Have you heard of MS13? Mara Salvatrucha, commonly abbreviated as MS13, is a street gang composed mainly of Salvadorans, but it was founded in the United States. It is seen as one of the most violent and notorious gangs in all the Americas, and until recently they terrorized the tiny Central American country of El Salvador, causing it to be one of the most dangerous countries in the world and a hotspot for murder and many other forms of criminality. Now in 2024, the question as to how the gang works could be answered quite concisely. Well, it doesn't. They're rotting in prison, but that doesn't tell the full story. Although the gang problem in El Salvador was seemingly largely resolved by President Bukele's nuclear response and with the creation of a vast, controversial prison system, it doesn't mean the gang nor its structures have completely disappeared. MS13 was established in Los Angeles by immigrants from El Salvador in the 1980s. Many of the would-be members were refugees who fled a brutal civil war in their country between left-wing and right-wing factions, a conflict which claimed around 75,000 lives and which lasted from 1979 until 1992. A large number of those Salvadorans, along with Guatemalans fleeing their own country's civil war, were undocumented, and their numbers included a large amount of minors. Due to a combination of this and general prejudice, many were unable to find jobs in the US, which led to a rise in criminality and contributed to the formation of the gang. The prospects of undocumented Central Americans in the US improved somewhat with a landmark legal case, American Baptist Churches and Thornburg, which began in the late 1980s and was brought against the Immigration and Naturalization Service and others by several religious groups and human rights organizations. The lawsuit eventually ensured that the Guatemalan and Salvadorans' refugee asylum requests had to be assessed once more, given that discrimination and prejudice had impacted their initial requests, and that in 1984 only 3% of Salvadoran immigrants had succeeded in receiving asylum. However, one of the provisions of the case was that asylum requests and the right to settlement would be excluded for people with a conviction for an aggravated felony. Barred also from a renewed assessment were Salvadorans who'd migrated to the US between 1990 and the end of 1991. And while the legal suit sought to minimize rates of deportation even for individuals whose asylum requests were rejected, it was determined that this would not extend to those who'd committed a crime of so-called moral turpitude, typically either one which resulted in a sentence of at least 6 months, or which meant that the individual posed a national security risk or a threat to public safety. But by then, fairly severe convictions were exactly what many of the gang-affiliated individuals in the US had. And only 1 year after the conclusion of the suit, the civil war in El Salvador had ended. With the perceived threat subsided, many Salvadorans whose asylum was rejected were shipped straight back to a war-ravaged country with precious few functioning state structures in place. Thus, the small Central American country became the breeding ground for what would become one of the most notorious gangs in the world. And perhaps one thing that has faded into the background with the recent downgrading of the threat posed by MS13 is how bad they were, because they were really bad. Infanticide, or the killing of children, was common, as was femicide, with around 1 in 5,000 Salvadoran women killed in 2016 alone. The gangs would commonly recruit children to take part in their criminal activities, which typically revolved around trafficking and extortion. As the years went on, MS13 would begin to get into feuds with other Salvadoran gangs, most notably Barrio 18, also founded in Los Angeles, as well as Mexican gangs having been recruited by groups like the Sinaloa Cartel to aid in their conflict with the Los Zetas. The gang also gained notoriety for the intimidation and violence that it would use towards objectives such as extorting payments from legitimate or illegitimate businesses in so-called MS13 territory. According to the US Department of Justice, this would include rapes and other forms of witness intimidation. Board gang members in El Salvador would shoot at passers-by, often children, safe in the knowledge that they would not be held accountable for their actions. Such was the level of power that the gang held for many years. By far the biggest revenue stream for the organization came from the illegal trafficking of various goods as well as narcotics. Stolen vehicles would be taken from the United States for resale in Central America, and MS13 also participated in weapons smuggling and illegal firearm sales. The gang is believed to be a major retail distributor of drugs in some parts of the United States, such as Texas, and is also believed to operate traveling theft crews which steal medications for later sale on the illegal drug market. There have also been reports of MS13's involvement in human smuggling. MS13 would often recruit poor or vulnerable teenagers, and its initiation process was similarly brutal to its various other practices. Joining would require being jumped in, being subjected to a vicious 13-second beating by existing members. The number 13 features prominently in the group's symbolism, being the alphabetic number representing the letter M for Mara, and commonly featuring in gang slogans, graffiti tattoos, and the MS13 abbreviation. New members would also be expected to start by getting wet, in other words, carrying out a crime, often a murder, on behalf of the gang. Leaving would be dangerous, potentially even lethal, as according to the BBC, some factions were known to murder members who attempted to leave. It would also be rather hard, since large chest and often face tattoos would brand members for life. In many ways, joining the gang, therefore, amounted to a deal for life. Despite this, MS13's membership ballooned over the decades. A 2008 FBI threat assessment put the size of the gang at between 8,000 and 10,000 members in the US alone, making it one of the largest criminal enterprises in the country. Unlike other major international crime organizations, MS13 operates largely without a clearly defined leadership structure. Instead, it's made up of a number of loosely affiliated cells known as cliques, which vary in size and operate in a specific area or a territory. Depending on the size of the cell, it may be part of a larger collective known as a programa, which in turn is led by a council of veteran gang members. Each clique is responsible for its own recruitment, and this allows both a level of autonomy and, above all, a high turnover of members, but it comes at the expense of authority, coordination, and the sophisticated chain of command present in other Central American gangs and cartels. Part of the high turnover of members is also probably necessary due to the fact that the gang and its members are rather distinctive and have made for clear-cut targets for law enforcement. Aside from the distinctive tattoos worn on visible parts of their bodies, including the face, as we said, gang members could be suspected by their nationality. Salvadorans represent a rather small population in the US, and the population, perhaps unfairly, came to be associated with the gang as it gained notoriety. Another identifying element is the MS13 gang sign, a distinctive gesture which resembles the sign of the horns made by fans of metal and is believed to have its origins in the close association of the group's early members with the California heavy metal scene. Alex Sanchez was a former MS13 member who was interviewed about his experience for Insider Magazine's True Crime podcast in 2024. His experience seemed to mirror much of what was known about the gang's rise, as well as its culture and structures. After arriving in the US shortly after the outbreak of the Civil War in 1979, Sanchez joined the gang at an early age and described the fraternal bonds offered by membership to impoverished and often homeless youths, its regular use of machetes as an instrument of violence, principally because they were cheap, and rapid descent into territorial disputes and feuds with other gangs. He was arrested several times and was quickly deported when the war in El Salvador ended in 1993. There, Sanchez described how the evolving conflict between the gangs in LA had found its way back to the old country, with the gangs' overt violence simply replacing the brutality of the Civil War, resulting in that the safety of everyday citizens quickly spiraled out of control. As the threat posed by the group rose in the 2000s, the Salvadoran government took measures which they hoped would contain its power. This included the introduction of La Mano Dura and Super Mano Dura, translating to the firm hand and the super firm hand from 2003. The policies saw increased police raids in gang-held areas, greater engagement of the military, and tougher sentences for suspected gang members. This appeared to have an effect on MS13 and its now major rivals, Barrio 18, who agreed to a truce which saw a reduction in the scale of murders. El Salvador reported a 14% fall in homicides in 2004. But in reality, the period of lull was simply intended to allow the factions to consolidate and focus on recruitment, restructuring, and activities such as extortion. The homicide rate rebounded and reached a new high in 2005. When this became clear, the government appeared to take a new line on the problem through the Pinochet-style approach of simply shooting up the gang members whenever possible. But these extrajudicial killings just drew the ire of the public and resulted in a further boost to recruitment of the organizations and a greater distrust of the state security forces. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Mano Dura and the policies of following administrations failed, and by 2015, El Salvador had a murder rate which outranked even the body count at the height of the Civil War. Everyday freedoms were suppressed by the gangs, private enterprise was crippled by the constant extortion, and the streets became particularly unsafe for women and children. All of this came at a great cost, not only to citizens' safety, but also to the economy of El Salvador, which at $24 billion GDP in 2016 was comparable to the struggling African country of Zimbabwe, and it had become reliant on remittances being sent home from the vast Salvadoran diaspora in the US and elsewhere. It seemed that the gangs had brought El Salvador to its knees. But this would all change in the 2020s with the rise to power of Nayib Bukele. Bukele was elected president of El Salvador in 2019. Although he is now well known, especially in the Americas, for his uncompromising charge against the country's gangs and for introducing a model that Latin American governments with a similar gang problem have sought to emulate, it was only 3 years into his presidency that Bukele truly unleashed his plan of action against the criminal groups. In the intervening period, as we mentioned in a previous video on the topic, Bukele had laid the groundwork for the measures that would facilitate his objective, including overhauling the legislature and the Supreme Court to his favor. Now, even so, there didn't appear to be much likelihood that a strong-handed approach against the gangs would work. These gangs were by now so powerful that it was not believed that even a robust and incorruptible state would be able to do away with them in one fell swoop. The Guardian commented in 2020 that, quote, "The Maras will not simply be killed off or arrested away. Neither will the consequences of their continuing evolution be walled off behind national boundaries, increasingly intertwined as they are with the currents of illicit supply and demand that tie producers to the US, the world's largest market for illegal drugs." But a breaking point came in 2022. Although the rate of homicide had been falling for several years, it spiked massively over a single weekend in March that year, during which 87 people were murdered. It was believed that many of the killings, most of them random, were a response to increasing crackdowns by Bukele's government on gang activity. Following the violence, an extraordinary session of the Salvadoran Legislative Assembly met and put into place a so-called state of exception. More of Bukele's reforms were quickly passed, and he came down on the gang hard. Members of Bukele's party, Nuevas Ideas, passed laws which increased prison sentences for convicted gang members by 300% to at least 20 years and at least 40 for gang lords. The age of criminal responsibility was also reduced. Previously, 16 years, now children as young as 12 were subject to imprisonment for gang affiliation. According to Diario El Mundo, a Salvadoran newspaper, between March 2022 and October 2024, the government arrested more than 82,000 people. In other words, around 1.2% of the entire population. The government published its figures on the 3rd of October 2024, further declaring it had arrested 463 people in only the previous 15 days. Now, all of this might sound crazy, but the country's defense ministry estimated in 2019, the year that Bukele took office, that of the 6 million or so population, a startling 500,000 Salvadorans were in some way involved or dependent on the gangs. It was also estimated that in 2020, the number of active members of MS13 alone in El Salvador was something close to 60,000. So, Bukele rounded them up, and he set about constructing well-lit, gargantuan prisons with tight security into which convicted or suspected members of gangs would be flung en masse for arbitrary lengths of time. The challenge for El Salvador's president was also to ensure that the individuals would stay in custody, which he accomplished by slapping them with the aforementioned prison terms, which could run up to several hundred years, and bulwarking the prisons with a Warhammer-style force of personnel. The prison conditions are hardly idyllic. Lights remain on at all times, meaning that even at night, inmates are subject to constant light intrusion, no doubt causing sleep deprivation. Prisoners in CCOT, a maximum security installation and the largest prison in all of Latin America, are only allowed to leave their cells for 30 minutes a day to exercise, and the cells are both overcrowded and stifling. Temperatures can reach 35 degrees Celsius, something exacerbated by poor ventilation. Latrine facilities are lacking too, and food provision is minimal. Of course, Bukele's rampaging response has received some severe criticism. For one thing, it is highly doubtful whether all of this is in any way constitutional, since Bukele overrode parts of the Salvadoran constitution to freeze gang members' rights to a criminal defense, inviolability of correspondence, as well as laws restricting terms of legal detention. But one of the biggest criticisms of the prison system is the high levels of inmate-on-inmate violence suspected there. One human rights observer commented that the prisons appeared to be used to, quote, dispose of people without formally applying the death penalty. To which Amnesty International added that El Salvador is experiencing the gradual replacement of gang violence with state violence. The Associated Press reported in 2024 that at least 261 people had died in state-run prisons since the beginning of Bukele's crackdown on the gangs 2.5 years earlier. Of those, 88 were the result of an undefined criminal act, possibly an attempt to escape, while 87 were due to illness and 14 were due to unspecified acts of violence. No cause of death was identified for the remaining 72. Bukele's tactics were also criticized by Alex Sanchez in his insider interview, pointing to the failure of past zero-tolerance initiatives such as La Mano Dura, which doubled El Salvador's prison population but failed to bring the gangs down, and starting that mass incarceration was likely only to further radicalize some young people, especially those arbitrarily detained, rather than bringing an end to the problem. But despite negative press, Bukele's government has proved highly popular in El Salvador, especially in the wake of a tumbling homicide and general crime rate. The homicide rate, according to government figures, collapsed all the way down to 2.4 per 100,000 people in 2023 from a high of 106 8 years before. Concurrently, El Salvador's GDP has risen sharply, increasing from $24 billion in 2016 to $34 billion in 2023. And this brings its GDP ahead of countries like Jamaica, Guyana, and Nicaragua, and only marginally behind neighboring Honduras, a much larger country with more natural resources and about 4 million people. And although El Salvador's GDP per capita is still quite weak at around $5,300 and far short of the regional average, it's predicted that the country will continue its sharp economic rise in the coming years, possibly bringing the prospects of everyday Salvadorans up with it. Bukelism has since been exported to other countries suffering from similar gang crime deluges, and Bukele himself romped to re-election in February 2024, having previously succeeded in removing the Constitution clause prohibiting second terms for presidents. Still, like with any criminal organization, MS13 has shown a distinct capacity for regeneration. Even if Bukele succeeds in stamping out the organization in El Salvador, which, as the pace of recent arrests seemingly indicates, an organization with roots as deep as MS13 has other means at its disposal. In its current form, the gang is most present in the United States. MS13 members routinely continue to be implicated in murders across multiple states, from California all the way to Massachusetts. And this is hardly a new development. MS13, with its ferocious reputation and involvement in several high-profile crimes in the US, has been on the radar of American administrators for some time. The gang was identified as a significant threat in the 1990s, and the first special FBI task force was convened to target the gang in 1994. But dealing with the organization entails a sort of quagmire for the US. President Bukele's freedom to hit pause on constitutional rights might fly in El Salvador, but it would definitely not work in the US. The ability to arbitrarily detain individuals is something curtailed in the US legal system, and no president nor district attorney would have the option to throw children in prisons for heavy sentences, although notably some room for detention has been documented under the protocols of ICE, the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. The best that the US could do is deport Salvador nationals back to El Salvador, which is exactly what they've been doing, and which gathered pace with the establishment of the FBI's MS-13 National Gang Task Force established in 2004. But aside from historically only exacerbating the situation in El Salvador, much to the ire of its citizens and government, this would not be an option for ethnic Salvadorans who are US citizens, and as a reminder, the US works under a jus soli system of citizenship, whereby anybody born in the US or its overseas possessions is automatically a citizen, even if their parents were only temporarily visiting. There are around 2.5 million ethnic Salvadorans in the US, according to Pew Research Center, around 36% of whom are US citizens, and only around 1.3 million are born in El Salvador. Now, it is important to recall that only a tiny fraction of Salvadorans are in any way connected with the gangs. Still, the size of the gang, given the long years of freedom it enjoyed in El Salvador, is certainly very, very substantial. In 2018, it was reported that MS-13's presence in the US had swelled to 10,000 members. The same year, in his first State of the Union address, President Donald Trump rallied against the savage gang MS-13 and called on Congress to, quote, finally close the deadly loopholes that allowed MS-13 and other criminals to break into our country. You see, it would appear that instead of being shunted out of the US to Central America, as was once the case, MS-13 has come to largely find a home on American soil. Suspected members of the gang have been arrested not only in El Salvador, but in places like Virginia, Maryland, and New York. Of the many current or former MS-13 leaders sought by the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, 2 have been arrested to date, and both were arrested within the US, one in Houston and one in Southern California. Now, all of this is hardly surprising. Given the rampage of Bukele against the organization in El Salvador, it is as if the opposite effect has taken place to what occurred in the 1990s and the 2000s, and which led to the flourishing of the gang in America in the first place. It is now believed that MS-13 has fled back to the US and has a presence in around 46 US states. According to Insight Crime, there may be as many as 20 MS-13 cliquers operating in Los Angeles alone, a further 12 in Greater Washington, and 10 in the New York district of Long Island. But its presence in the US is not all. MS-13 members have also been arrested in Mexico, and its presence in that country is upheld by established links with criminal factions such as the Sinaloa cartel and the Mexican mafia. The group has a presence in other nearby countries too. The highest ranked of many MS-13 leaders currently on the run is believed to be Yulea Donna Arcaga Carreras, a native and most likely resident of Honduras, neighboring country to El Salvador. Back in the US, the question of gang violence linked to immigration problems has become a ferocious theme in American political discourse, with Republicans and Democrats trading blame. Many Democrats have pointed to so-called sanctuary cities as hotbeds of criminal gang activity, blaming the Democratic Party for enabling these. In fact, accusations of being weak on immigration have been a common weapon used against the Democrats since at least the 1990s. It was during this time which President Bill Clinton sought to display a robust position on the issue with the notorious Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibilities Act. Trump in particular frequently lambasted his predecessor Barack Obama for his supposedly permissive attitude on immigration, which led to the proliferation of gangs such as MS-13. And while this accusation is likely exaggerated by Trump and other Republicans, a 2017 paper featured in the US Department of Justice Federal Online Library stated that the policies attributable to the Obama administration led to a tenfold increase in crimes in the United States committed by MS-13. With that said, the author's sympathetic descriptions of Trump's heavy rhetoric and reference to MS-13 members as, quote, common thugs would seem to indicate a certain level of political partisanship, although the team was echoed by New York Governor and Democrat Andrew Cuomo in a statement from that same year, in which he announced measures to curb the group's presence on the East Coast. Nevertheless, the threat of MS-13 remains large in the US. In 2023, there remain multiple MS-13 leaders, members, and associates besides Chiares who are wanted by both the FBI and the DHS. Each government agency is offering $10,000 for information leading to their arrest and conviction.